Hi, I'm Judy Martin, and today I'm going to show you some tips from my book, Singular Stars, Judy Martin's book of Lone Star quilts. And the first thing I want to show you is something you may not have thought about unless you sewed clothes before you sewed quilts, and that is the lengthwise grain. This is a long yardage, and I have trimmed the selvage off of this, and you'll notice all these little spools are even along the edge. The crosswise grain is also a straight grain, but the print isn't straight with it. Now, this isn't always the case with fabrics, but in this case it's so bad I couldn't use the fabric. Now I want to show you something about the stretchiness. Everybody knows the bias on the diagonal between the crosswise and lengthwise grains is the stretchiest part of the fabric, but the crosswise grain is also stretchy. Notice I'll put my hands about shoulder length apart and stretch here. See how much that's the straight grain. Now this is the lengthwise grain, and it doesn't have the selvage on anymore either. I put it the same distance apart, look. And if you snap it, you can hear the difference. See that lower tone of that? That's stretchy. And so most of the time that won't matter for your quilts if you're using squares and half square triangles and things like that, because those have half of the sides on the lengthwise grain and half on the crosswise grain. However, if you're making a Lone Star with diamonds, after you've got all the strip sets made and then cut down, you're going to have half on the bias and half on the crosswise grain if you cut crosswise strips. So I suggest cutting lengthwise strips so you get something there that you can count on to be the size it's supposed to be. When you cut on the lengthwise grain, it's just like cutting on the crosswise grain. If you have fat quarters and half yards, you just cut the full length of the fabric, but it's the 18-inch way, not the 22-inch way. And so the lengthwise grain is parallel to the selvage, and here you see the selvage. It's already been trimmed off on this side, but I'll show you. I have to start by trimming the selvage off, and usually a 1/2 inch or 5/8 inches is enough. And you just, now ordinarily I wouldn't have a wrinkly fabric like this. I traveled here to do this video, and I would have pressed it, I would have layered it with other fabrics that would also be pressed, and I press one fabric and then I put the next one on it and I press it on together. And after I'm done pressing with steam to get rid of the folds and everything, I also press with the dry iron so it won't be, I don't know if you notice that things when they have steam on them, they tend to be looser and you want to tighten it up again. So I've cut myself a 2 1/4 inch strip here. Now if I were doing folded fabric, which I don't need to do with these half yard lengths, if I were doing folded fabric I would have to unfold it in order to cut the end off at an angle. The reason I cut the end off at an angle is because eventually you're going to be cutting them at an angle. Like here's a strip set that we're going to be making, and you have to stagger them like this, but it's easier if you cut the end off, then it's easy to get them lined up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this over because I'm right-handed and I have to cut this way, and I want my strip to look like this. So I turned it over in order to do that, or you could rotate it around, either way. That gives me the 45-degree angle taken off, and the last thing that I do is I use my point trimmer, and it has triangles shown on it, and you aren't cutting triangles, but you're cutting things that are the same angle as this. And anything with a 45-degree angle, whether it's a trapezoid, a triangle, or a diamond, or a strip like this, has the same 45-degree angle here, and it will always stick out the same amount past the end of the tool. And so you just align the two converging lines here with the two adjacent sides of your strip and trim that off. And so I have this point. Now, This is really handy because when I sew it to the next strip, this one will be here and this one will be here, and I align this edge right here, and right here at the point, this angle matches this line here, and that is the perfect place to start that. And when you have sewn your strips with that, this hasn't been trimmed yet. This is the way they come out. See how even that is? That's easy to do because of this little point trim. And you can do that through 4 layers if you want to. That works just fine. So we've cut on the lengthwise grain, we've trimmed the end off at a 45-degree angle, and we've trimmed the point. And the whole point of trimming points is alignment. If you're cutting from long yardage, you do it along the lengthwise grain again, but you just cut off an 18-inch strip from the corner of your fabric. You don't, and then you can, if you're going to cut another strip later, you can do it next to it or you can do it above it, depending on what you're trying to save your fabric for. So you're going to want to have your seam allowance right when you're making your Lone Star. If you don't, it will give you fits, I guarantee. That's what most people have problems with with all their patchwork. If your your patches have uneven edges, they don't all end in the same place, that's usually a seam allowance problem. This is my seam allowance test sample. I have you cut 9 squares, 1.5 inches each, and 1 rectangle, 1.5 by 9.5. That would be, these should be the same size once you've sewn them. And in this example, the seam allowance is right because they end at the same place. Most commonly, people err on the side of seams that are too deep. And in this case, I've sewn the 9 squares and the rectangle is bigger. That means the seam allowances were too deep in the squares, and we need to adjust our seam allowance for take-up, which means the amount of fabric that gets used up going around the hump of the seam allowance and in the stitching line with the thread. It's just a small amount. This one is seam allowances that are too shallow, where the squares are longer than the rectangle, and both of these take the same correction. You just adjust your seam line either deeper or shallower so that the squares end up the same size as the rectangle. Now here's a throat plate from my sewing machine, and it shows black electrical tape that I've cut with scissors. Don't tear it because it'll curve. So my throat plate had lines on it, and I was able to follow those lines, and I went just to the other side of the line so that I knew I was going straight. If your lines aren't helping you, what you can do is put a piece of tape on the other side where you can actually see the line that's helping you, and then put another piece of tape next to it and peel off the first piece so that the lines there will help you. But once you get your seam allowance right, that is going to help you in all your patchwork, and you will never have to trim down again because you'll get it right in the first place. That's the biggest shortcut of all. Thank you for watching. You can find my books, Singular Stars, and other books at C&T Publishing, or from judymartin.com on the internet, or from your favorite quilt store. Thank you.